Hello and welcome to another episode of the albums that shaped me. So this week's albums that shaped me is Angel Witch by Angel Witch. So this was released in December of 1980, and this is another band who I have to thank the Friday Rock Show for getting me into. So in a previous episode, I think it was the Rainbow episode, I detailed how on a fateful evening I stumbled across the Friday Night Rock Show on Radio 1. Now sometime later, and I've actually managed to pin down the date by a bit of detective work, I discovered Angel Witch. I discovered a lot of bands actually as a result of the Friday Rock Show that were placed under this umbrella called the new wave of British heavy metal. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those bands because 1980 was a real golden year for those bands. A lot of the bands had debut albums out in that year. Some bands had 2 albums out. So a lot of bands are on mainly their first album at that point. Some bands had albums out in 79. There were also other bands that weren't initially, predate Nawubum, like Motorhead, Judas Priest, and other artists who had moved on to second careers from being in other bands during the period of the new wave of British heavy metal and were able to sort of ride the wave. So we'll get onto that discussion in a moment. But let's go back to this debut album. So, yeah, if you've never checked it out on Spotify, give it a listen. I mean, obviously, it's got a very 1980s sound to it. But, yeah, this band did inspire a lot of later thrash bands as well because they managed to combine aggressiveness with melody. And some of the tracks, well, one of the tracks in particular when I first heard it was probably the heaviest thing I'd heard at the time. And that was a track called Extermination Day, rather appropriately titled. Yeah, a lot of their tracks, let's just have a look. Yeah, Angel Witch, Atlantis, White Witch, Confused, Sorcerers, Gorgon, Sweet Danger, Free Man, Angel of Death, Devil's Tower. They all have a certain Hammer horror vibe to them, I suppose. And yeah, I just lapped it up as at the time what I would have been 16, I suppose. Yeah, 16. And I thought it was great. I was genuinely scared by the band, particularly the track Angel of Death. Which is quite stompy actually. It's not one of their faster tracks, but there's also other almost like pseudo ballads as well on here, like Free Man, and they were good with the dynamics. I mean, the guitarist Kevin Hayburn, I think it is, if I've pronounced his name right. I'm terrible with names of some band members in bands. Yeah, guitarist, to all intents and purposes, he is Angel Witch. He's kept the band going. But the interesting thing about this band is, to me, in terms of the episodes I've done so far, this band is like the antithesis of a lot of bands I've spoken about, in that this band acted more like a gateway band to me, in that I bought the album when it came out and didn't buy them after that because to all intents and purposes to me they disbanded. But they got me into a lot of other bands that were part of the Nawubum movement, which we'll talk about in a moment. And part of that was because of just the sheer amount of albums that came out in 1980 that were either by new wave of British heavy metal bands or the bands that had a similar sound that people were locking onto. the other thing that really drew me in was actually the artwork. Now, I didn't really, I mean, I was aware of the artwork being done by someone called John Martin, didn't know who he was, and it wasn't until years later, probably not till the late 2010s, even the 2020s, where I started like looking up some of his work. And yeah, he has this really interesting, like, biblical style, I suppose, for want of a better word. The other thing that was curious is when I look up the specific piece of artwork, which is it on here? Let's have a look. Let me just look it up again, hang on. The fallen angels entering pandemonium. There it is. So it says formally attributed to John Martin. So if anyone out there knows more about John Martin, anybody know now why on the Tate website it says formally attributed to him? It is interesting because there's something about the, what would I say, just, yeah, the look of it. Although it's in a similar style, it does look, different. The colours are a lot more muted than in the other work that's on there. Now, I just assumed maybe that was the medium, but, I mean, looking at this, I mean, it's not far removed, but yeah, anyway, if anybody knows more about John Martin, I'd be really interested in your comments. Maybe clear that up. So yeah, Friday Rock Show has a lot to answer for. After I tuned in on that fateful day at the end of, what was it, November 79, I listened to it every week for a long time, for several years. And as a consequence, and I managed to track it, on the 14th of March, I listened to this episode, and there was this track, Extermination Day by Angel Witch, and that was the one that really sort of hooked me. And so, yeah, from that point onwards, because that was early on in the year from when the album came out, I was just sort of chomping at the bit for the album to come out. One of the problems I had was a lot of the bands I really liked at the time, like Praying Mantis and Diamond Head, their albums weren't released on major labels until a lot later. Diamond Head did have an album available, but I think it was by mail order. So it wasn't until later when I picked up their sort of major label debut after like 1980. So yeah, that was the thing. And also for some reason, although I was aware of Iron Maiden, I don't know why I didn't go out and buy their first album. It's really odd, even though I was listening to them on the Friday Rock Show. And I didn't, the first album I bought by Iron Maiden was actually the second one, which came out after 1980. Now, I think another contributing factor is there was just a lot of music in the house at the time, because I think, as I've mentioned, myself and my two younger brothers sort of joined forces. So between like 81 and about 82, we managed to acquire between us quite an impressive collection of Nawubum albums, both on vinyl and cassette. And other things I was going to mention, because it ties in quite a bit, is these compilation albums, these Metal for Mothers Volume 1 and 2. Eventually, years later, I got hold of a copy of this, but I remember seeing this at the time, the first one, and that had the Angel Witch track Baphomet, which I think, I'm not sure whether that was released as a single or not. We'll have a look in a moment. So there was, stuff by them kicking around. So this is a bit confusing here because this is the tracks listing for Volume 1. So February 1980, before that session, they had a track on this compilation album, and there was other stuff on there, Wrathchild by Iron Maiden. I'm not sure exactly. Well, we'll have a look in a moment and see when the first Iron Maiden came out, because I'm going to go to them in a moment. Timeline-wise, this is the sort of where I'm talking about. You can see here there's this period where I just had assumed they'd completely packed up. Kevin Riddle had left the band and gone and formed, I think, a band called Titan. After the album was released, Dave Hogg left and was replaced by Dave Dufort, who's actually the brother of Denise Dufort from Girls' School. If you're familiar with Nibblebum bands, you'll know who they are. And I bought the follow-up single to this, which I think had a track called Loser on it. And yeah, that was it, sort of one and done, and one single and done. And obviously, like I said, a member of the fan club. But there was no internet in that day, so when you stopped hearing from for a band and you'd heard they'd split up, I tended to assume the worst. And anyway, they didn't have another actual album out until a lot later. And by this time, I was into other forms of music, although I was still listening to a lot of extreme, metal and extreme music at that time. I had been sort of sucked in by like a lot of indie bands, and we'll get to a later episode about my sort of slight musical transformation in 84 into 85 as well. So yeah, that will be sometime down the line. I thought it'd be interesting just to look at around the time of that album release, because like I said, I bought it when it came out. Interestingly, it's not listed in the regular albums listing, although it is listed in the heavy metal section on Wikipedia for this year, for 1980. I'm not sure why that is, because there's other stuff listed here, which is 100 Miles Per Hour by Vardis. But the problem with the heavy metal one is they've not got round on Wikipedia to organising it in date order. They have with later stuff. But it came out around this time. Flash Gordon was out by Queen. I'm just looking back to seeing if there was anything around this that I bought. Oh, Ace of Spades by Motorhead. Yep, we definitely had that in the house. In the Flatfield, didn't buy till later. Live in the Heart of the City, Whitesnake. Yeah, there's quite a number of bands that where they were ex-members of Deep Purple, like kicking around. So, the Whitesnakes, Gillan, I call them the Whitesnakes. Whitesnake, Gillan, Rainbow, all those. In fact, Gillan has quite a number of albums deep by now. What else we got? George Thorogood, Levitation by Hawkwind. Japan, they weren't a metal band, but that'll come later, Japan. Boy by U2 was actually out that year. Thin Lizzy, Chinatown, we mentioned. Oh, there's Glory Road by Gillan. First Killing Joke album. Yeah, more specials by Specials. And so on. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about 1980 generally in terms of the UK bands as well. I've got a interesting spreadsheet I'm going to bring up. Absolute Game by the Skids. Yeah, there's a lot of like new wave bands, post-punk bands that I was also aware of and liked, but didn't buy albums by them. And other things like, there's the Ozzy Osbourne's debut album came out then. Strong Arm of the Law by Saxon as well. There were 2 albums out that year by Saxon. So let's look at some of these, albums that fall under the Nawubum banner that came out in 1980, the year 1980. So you've got Demolition by Girls' School. So these were all bands that I really got into as a result of entering into that ecosystem through pretty much Angel Witch, and there's a couple of other bands that weren't from the UK, but their sound sort of dragged me in. They had a similar sound. I mentioned Diamond Head. This came out in October of 1980. Like I said, it appeared to be mail order only, I think. And so I wasn't able to buy anything by them, I don't think, till Borrowed Time. I may have a single by them that came out slightly earlier than this. First Iron Maiden album, as I mentioned, didn't buy anything by them until the second album, and then I sort of infilled and started buying singles. A lot of singles around those early days. Yeah, Tigers of Pantang. One of my brothers was big into this band. We had the cassette kicking around the house of this, Wildcat, and this came out in 1980. And then there was vinyl for the 2 following albums. I think the following albums both came out in 81, yeah. And also The Cage in 82. Wheels of Steel. My other brother, big into Saxon. He had this album, Strong Arm of the Law, the first album. They had a lot of albums in 1980, 81. Yeah, they were making their money from their car washing business go a long way, seemingly. Unless they were getting pocket money and I didn't know anything about it. On Through the Night by Def Leppard, another album from 1980. I didn't buy anything of them until High and Dry in 81. But I'm sure we'll get around to maybe talking about them. Some of these bands I probably probably won't do a special episode about them, but certainly there'll be an episode about Iron Maiden. Yeah, pretty sure about that. She Agreed by Girl, 1980. Yeah, I had this cassette, and then years later, it got one of my brothers borrowed it. A long time after, when he had a car, and it got chewed up in the cassette player, unfortunately. But I don't know if you can actually. Maybe it is on Spotify. I don't know. There was actually another band that I got in through listening to sessions on Radio 1. That track listing I played you, or I didn't play you, I showed you. This was a session on the Friday Rock Show, and they had loads of sessions. Iron Maiden, that's really how I listened to them the first time around. Diamond Head, Def Leppard, they were all sessions being played on there before they had any album releases. Oh, jumped ahead a little bit there. Bit of a spoiler. Yeah, there's a cover of Do You Love Me from Destroyer. And what was interesting as well, their session is a lot heavier than this album. I was quite disappointed when I bought this. So I wasn't super upset when the tape got chewed up. They had a much, much heavier version of My Number on the in the Friday Rock Show sessions. Their big thing, there's a couple of things here. You probably recognise the name Phil Collen. He went on to play with Def Leppard. And Phil Lewis, he carried on, ended up in LA Guns. I think he was in Bernie Torme's band for a period of time as well. And Bernie Torme was a guitarist at one point in Gillan. So another instance where there's lots of interesting crossovers in these bands. What was it I might have mentioned before? We certainly didn't. We have we had Tigers of Pantang actually come up in another episode as well. Yeah, because of course, I was talking about it would have been in the Thin Lizzy episode. Yeah, of course. So yeah, lots of cross-pollination. But yeah, all these albums were in the house sometime after 1980, like I say, between about 80 and 82, where as a collective operation we acquired them. This one I didn't buy till a little bit later. It's the Michael Schenker Group, although one of my friends had a copy of this and I used to listen to it. Another album from 1980. Of course, Ace of Spades, yep. British Steel. One of my brothers was a big Judas Priest fan, as was I. Certainly we'll be doing an episode on Judas Priest, although I suspect, spoiler alert, it might not be this album, funnily enough. My sort of step on was a little bit earlier with that band, which I'll go into why in that episode. Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath. And yeah, they got mentioned in... So, my link to Black Sabbath, this era of Black Sabbath and then back, is more through, I suppose, Rainbow really, and Dio, strangely. And another thing, I don't know if I told the story, but when I was in the sixth form in 81, I was a big Sabbath fan, and it was before I really, 1980 to 81. So I remember sometime in 1980 walking around the school to the common room, and you could just hear Sabbath. I can't remember which album it was. It wasn't this one. It was an earlier one, like blaring out down the corridors, because this Sabbath fan had like stuck it on the sixth form, what would you call it, like stereo system, and it was like blaring out. Yeah. But yeah, and then there were other interesting bands around in that ecosystem that weren't from the UK. So this album, Metal Rendezvous, got a couple of their albums. I was tempted to do an episode on this band, but they're more of a it was more like a band that I discovered along the way, although it, as a result of listening to other bands, although it was a very early album that I bought as part of that sort of 1980 album release. And I was also going to mention Riot as well. This came out in 79, but I picked this album up in 1980. Again, they're not from the UK, they're an American band, but there was something about the style and the pace of the music as well that had sort of attracted me to them. And then finally, and because I could go on forever, there's so many bands that I really just got into as a result of my ear being attenuated, whatever the correct term is, and maybe that's not the correct term, by Angel Witch. And this was another band that were played on the Friday Rock Show. Trust, they were pretty unique at the time. When I heard them around the time of Repression, it was pretty unusual for a sort of hard rock stroke heavy metal band to deal with political issues. And so I wouldn't say they went down that well. It's interesting as well, there's two versions of this album. I bought the English version on vinyl originally. Apparently they were helped with the lyrics for that by Jimmy Percy from Sham 69, according to the album notes. But there's also the original French version, which subsequently I picked up on CD sometime in the 2000s. And yeah, it actually got slightly different mix to it as well. I'm trying to remember if the saxophone is dialed back on the English version. But the tracks, the mix definitely sounds slightly different. And of course, when it's sung, in its original French, it sounds much more aggressive as well. Foolishly, I didn't bring any water with me. Where throat's locking up a little bit. So let's just move on to the usual thing here that I always do at the end. So I thought it would be interesting to run a few things in Bing Chat. And you've seen these before, so I just change out the album name. So I normally do one where it's listing 5 bands from the same era. I'm not sure why this happened, but never mind. That's better. So Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, Witchfind, Satan, and Merciful Fate, interestingly enough. Oh, there we go as well. You got like, can you recommend some modern bands with similar styles to Angel Witch? That's pretty cool. Yeah, I remember the first time I heard Merciful Fate on Friday Rock Show. That was pretty unusual sound at the time with the dual vocals, but King Diamond was doing both vocals. And the really screechy stuff and the really like regular register stuff, but not quite the same as say Rob Halford. So you can see why a lot of later extreme metal bands were inspired or influenced by Merciful Fate. Yeah. And then what I was going to do is do this a second time. I needed the one to run. So I'm just going to do the same, very similar to the other one, but take out the clause about the same era. And then just see if it casts its net a little bit wider. And then the other thing I will bring up and bring across is the suggestion stuff from Spotify and LastFM. Diamond Head, Witchfinder General, Satan, Cloven Hoof, and Pagan Altar. Yeah, same sort of era really. But we could do this, which is suggest some modern bands that play similar music. That doesn't work. So we're probably going to see this when I do this. Sometimes there'll be a bigger difference between the one where it says same era and the one where it doesn't. Haunt, Enforcer, Night Demon, Striker, Cauldron, yeah. Yeah, there's been several resurgence of Nawubum. The funny thing, of course, now is it's just a case of people copying the style, but they can be from anywhere in the world. So, yeah, so this is this little program I put together where I go through the LastFM API and returns like 50 artists that are their algorithm has determined are close in terms of people that like Angel Witch also have played this band, and then also it looks up the most popular album, the most played album by that band according to LastFM. And as I've said before, obviously that's based on what's called scrobbling data, and it really does depend on whether anybody still activates scrobbling in any of their music playing software, which I'm not sure about. But yeah, pretty wide net here. I recognise some of these as being from the UK, some from the US, but certainly, yeah, very much in the same area music-wise. And then there's the Spotify one, and a little bit at the end where I sort of do a bit of a Pareto analysis, a crude Pareto analysis on the data and how many times the band's name turns up when I look up other associated bands down to 2 levels. Actually, I forgot to mention Raven. I'm not sure when Rock Until You Drop came out actually, but that's another band. Although that was really more me hearing the track completely separately. And there used to be a night when I used to do all my homework, which wasn't on Saturday night. It was another day of the week. Sorry, it wasn't on Friday night. It was another day of the week, I think. And I do a lot of the homework on the same evening, and I'd listen to one of the commercial radio stations, and out of the blue someone played I Don't Need Your Money Honey off of Rock Till You Drop. And so that's really how I became aware of them. And then they started getting played on the Friday Rock Show as well. Or maybe I just noticed them a lot more. They had a session on there as well, but it might have been a little bit later than other bands I was listening to that they had a session. Cloven Hoof, Tokyo Blade, Witch Find, Picture. Picture from, I'm trying to remember where they're from actually. Grim Reaper, some of these are a little bit later. Tigers of Pantan, Jaguar. And there's quite a few woman bands that, had singles out, and that was about it really. There was quite a lot, they were quite heavily influenced by the punk rock ethos of doing your own thing, like DIY. So a lot of stuff was released on independent labels. And a lot of bands did get signed up by major labels, but then subsequently got dropped. In fact, Angel Witch were a case in point. They were originally signed to EMI for their first singles, then got dropped. And I think for the album they were signed to the Bronze label. So I have quite a cool book written by I think the publication is called Iron Pages, and it just lists like an eye-watering amount of UK bands from that early 80s period that had, and a lot of them had like one or two singles out as well. So it's like one of those things where you scratch the surface, there's like a massive amounts of regional scenes in the UK, and at that point there were all these bands releasing singles on independent labels or their own record label. Essentially they were setting up their own record labels. So punk, a lot of bands learnt tricks from punk basically in terms of distributing their stuff without the help of the major labels. And then one last thing I did want to just bring up, there's a spreadsheet here. Let me try and blow this up a bit, because I wanted to give some impression of the general musical landscape at the time in terms of just specific UK bands that had albums out in that year, in 1980. So this is a sliced copy of the database, or the 1980 CSV, should I say, from Best Ever Albums, but just with the UK bands in it. I just wrote a little Python script to basically do that. So this is the CSV. Now, let me just blow this up a little bit. How big do I want to go? Oh yeah, that'd be good. So, Best Ever Albums, if you're not familiar, are like a sort of they're similar to what, Metacritic, but just for music. Although their one is based on reviews from publications and other lists as well. There is some, I think people can submit reviews as well, but it seems to be their list when you compare it against, say, Album of the Year, which is another website like that. This one seems, in terms of the albums that crop up, a little bit more like it is biasing mainstream reviews more, because you get the usual suspects crop up. Whereas I've noticed on the Albums of the Year, suddenly this quite obscure album which is normally very good, will just like bubble up to the top of Album of the Year out of the blue. So this is in just in ranking order. So 1980 UK artists that had albums out that year, Closer by Joy Division. Scary Monsters, David Bowie, Peter Gabriel 3, Making Moves, Dire Straits, 17 Seconds by The Cure, Sandinista by The Clash, Heaven and Hell, I mentioned that before, Ace of Spades, Motorhead, Duke by Genesis, Get Happy, Iron Maiden, first album, Sound Effects, that was 4 albums in, I think, by them, by The Jam, British Steel, Judas Priest, Wizard of Oz, Ozzy Osbourne, The Game by Queen. Yeah, that was a big album in 1980. I was still big into Queen at that point, bought that album when it came out. Zenyatta Mondatta by The Police, so that was, 3 albums in by then. In the Flatfield Bauhaus first, is that the first album? I'm not sure. Can't remember. Might well be the first album, but don't quote me on that. Yeah, XTC. What else we got here? Kings of the Wild Frontier, first Killing Joke album, Kaleidoscope. Susie and the Banshees were reasonably far into their career by then. Vienna by Ultravox, first Psychedelic Furs album, Kilimanjaro by the Teardrop Explodes. I mean, a lot of this stuff I ended up buying years later. Japan, the Black Album by The Damned, yeah. There's Lightning to the Nations by Diamond Head. Mathematic by John Fox, Strong Arm of the Law. Yeah, the list goes on. But as we've been going down, you can see here specifically the Norwegian bands or other bands that fans of the new wave of British heavy were also fans of, like Whitesnake. In fact, they had 2 albums out that year, I think. They had the live album and Ready and Willing. Well, first Cirith column album. Again, I'm going off of topic here, but of course it's, I have very wide musical tastes, or did end up have ended up with very wide musical taste. Yeah, I bought that album when it came out. Just Testing by Wishbone Ash. Oh, there's Angel Witch. Brand New Age by UK Subs. I have that. Or had it. I had it on cassette. Def Leppard. Tigers of Bantang, as we mentioned. Girls' School. Cockney Rejects. I don't think that was actually their greatest hits. I think they just called it that, but again, I'm not 100% sure. That was a live album, that Vardis album. QE2, my dad has that. Quartz, Stand Up and Fight. Yeah, I'd forgotten about them. Yeah, I mentioned Gillan, Glory Road. And you got other cool stuff, again, outside of the metal genre. Too Much Pressure by The Selector. It's a Fad Gadget album. Head On by Samson. Yes, of course, that came out because that was the album with Bruce Dickinson before he joined Iron Maiden, back when he was still called Bruce. Status Quo had an album out. We might as well go all the way down to the bottom here. We're halfway down. No Place to Run. Not one of my favourite UK UFO albums, and we will get to be talking about UFO at some point. But it's got some, certain tracks on there that are excellent. Yeah, Budgie were having a bit of a resurgence. So they were one of those bands that pre-existed in the Woobham, like Judas Priest and Motorhead, and they had a bit of a resurgence around this time because people were picking up on the heavier stuff again. UK Subs have 2 albums out that year. The Skids, yes. So this would have been, by then, what was that, 3 albums in? I need to talk at some point in the future about the Skids and the Ruts and Big Country, I think. I'm not sure I'm going to all blend that together. Well, I do roughly know, but I'm just going to have to pick one of the albums, I think. They're a good band. Not heavy at all, but yeah. Oh, Bow Wow Wow, Your Cassette Pet. Well, Cabaret Voltaire were kicking around there then. 3 Mantras. I wasn't really aware of them until, I don't know, late 80s, I think. Chris Spedding. Now, there's a connection, isn't there, between... Didn't Chris Spedding record like an early... do some really early Pistols recordings, I think? Oh, there's the Girl album. Which find... Well, I didn't know Discharge were kicking around in 1980. I'm assuming that's the same Discharge that I'm aware of. Yeah, it's going to get slightly more obscure now. Some bands I just have no recollection of. Oh, there we go. So yeah, with the CSVs that you download from Best Ever albums, there's 1,000 entries in for each year. So you can see here, obviously I'm missing entries because this is only the UK stuff. If I was to bring up, let me just take that off screen for the moment while I do it. Let me try and find, I do have the unfiltered version, so you can just get a feel for all the other artists. I'm going to find it now. Bear with me, talk amongst yourselves. I think this could turn into quite a long episode, for good or bad. Yeah, you can see this is the raw version before I've sort of dropped information, rows and columns. So for those of you from other places in the world, this is now like every country from the Best Ever albums. So you can see, yeah, let me just try and highlight the top 20 there. There we go. So you can see Remain in Light, stuff I haven't mentioned. Oh look, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, Dead Kennedys 1980. Bruce Springsteen, The River, Permanent Waves by Rush. First Pretenders album. Interesting. What there? Oh, that's interesting. It looks like it's unclassified. So, yeah. I mean, they're UK based. I mean, Chrissie Hynde is originally from the States. Dire Straits, I forgot to mention them. We saw The Cure, 17 Seconds, The Clash, yep. U2, Motorhead, and so on and so forth. Well, there's X, Los Angeles as well. Yeah, I better stop here, otherwise I'll be talking about all of these albums. I'm looking down the list and thinking, yeah, I've done a lot of infilling over the years, looking at some of these albums I either currently own or have owned in various formats. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed that episode. These are always fun for me to make. Like I said, the only downside with this is I do get a bit self-absorbed with these, so they go on probably longer than I'd originally planned, but that's not always a bad thing. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.